As Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, money often costs too much. It was the middle of the night when a passing motorist saw a home going up in flames in Gisborne, New Zealand. The only resident was 88-year-old farmer Ronald Allison, who was always known as Russell. As the building crumbled to ashes, his son watched on helplessly, knowing he had just watched a murder take place, and he knew exactly who was responsible, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Russell Martin was a much-loved member of the Te Karaka community. He had lived there his entire life, and his parents before that. He was a World War II veteran, a rugby player, and a farmer, but most of all, Russell was a loving father. Russell and his wife Marie adopted 2 children after they were unable to have kids of their own. John came first, and a couple of years later they added Lynne to complete their family. Years later, Russell would write a letter to his daughter, sharing how it was love at first sight when he picked up Lynne from the hospital on the day of her adoption. The couple raised their kids on an 80-hectare farm, which was owned by Russell and his brother after they inherited it from their father. It was by all accounts an idyllic country childhood. For the first few years of their lives, John and Lynne got along well, but at around age 8 or 9, their parents started noticing some concerning behavioural issues in Lynne. At first it was tantrums and screaming matches, but then her behaviour took a more sinister turn. She started stealing and burning things. Even as she grew into her teen years, the tantrums never stopped, and her bad attitude grew more hateful. As a teenager, she was expelled twice from Waikohu College and then from Gisborne Girls High School. The only school that would take her was Solway College in Masterton, but even that didn't last longer than a couple of months before she was kicked out again. Lynne's parents were left with few choices but to keep her at home and have her complete her education via correspondence, but she refused to do her coursework and she was removed from the register. Without school, Lynne spent most of her days trying to get away from the tiny country town she called home. She would disappear for hours at a time while Russell and Marie worked the farm. Everyone crossed their fingers that she would grow out of it, sooner rather than later. But instead, things only got worse. When Lynne was 16, she found out she was pregnant. Abortion wasn't legal in New Zealand at the time, so her parents dipped into their savings and sent Lynne to Australia for their procedure. When Lynne returned, she told her parents she was moving to Auckland. Finally, Lynne was going to get a taste of the big city. It was in Auckland that she became involved in the Church of Scientology. It was a brief affair, and by the following year she had moved to Australia with a guy she was dating. By this stage, Lynne was just 17 years old and living in a foreign country with a guy she barely knew. Soon after the move, she gave birth to her first son. Within 2 years, her partner and their child had moved back to New Zealand, without Lynne. For the next few years, she earned a living as a sex worker in Townsville. Then she met Barry Tweeddale. He had 3 kids of his own and offered the stability that Lynne had long been seeking. For a while, it seemed like she had settled into domestic life. Barry and the kids were happy, and in 1986 they decided to move to New Zealand to be closer to her parents. But life on the other side of the ditch never felt quite right for Barry. His employment was inconsistent, and the couple struggled to make ends meet. After 2 years, they returned to Australia and settled in New South Wales. Not a lot is known about Barry or Lynne during this time. There are only vague records of any employment or housing, but it's understood she collected several criminal convictions during the intervening years. By 1999, Lynne was no longer in a relationship with Barry, and she was living with another man in the city of Orange, which is 250 kilometres from Sydney. On the 30th of April 1999, she got into an altercation at a pub and was removed by security. She left the pub and drove to a petrol station where she purchased a can of gasoline. She then drove to the partner's house, covered his motorbikes in fuel, and set them on fire. The fire service was called and the bikes were extinguished. But once they left, Lynne returned to the property and scratched abusive messages into the panels of a vehicle and then set them alight. Lynne was subsequently charged with arson. During the investigation, she was noted as saying, quote, "I've got a temper on me. Believe me, I have got a temper. I've got a mouth and I can use it, and legally I can get a person back, which I have done over the years. I don't need to go and vandalise somebody's car and burn it out." Looking back, the arson appears to be the first sign that Lynne's troublesome behaviour had taken a truly criminal turn. Up until then, most of her convictions were for DUI or causing a disturbance, but after the arson in Australia, many more concerning incidents would quickly follow. Later that year, Lynne returned to New Zealand to visit her parents. Here's what her brother John remembers of that visit. Quote, "I was living in town at the time and travelling back to the farm each day for work. I turned up that day to find a police car and the district nurse's car parked in the driveway. My parents and Uncle Pete, who was living there at the time, were all out on the veranda looking really crook. They were being sick, looking really subdued, looking like stunned mullets. Lynne was there too, looking really agitated and fidgety and saying someone had come into the house. There was this really strong, putrid chemical smell. It turned out someone had put the stuff, whatever it was, all through the milk, the butter, coffee, bread, the cold meat in a dish on the stove." Although it was never confirmed by the police, it appears that the family had been poisoned. The only person not to be affected by the unknown substance was Lynne. She was taken for a mental health assessment, but released soon after, and told to leave the farm within 48 hours. That was the first time John realised exactly what his sister was capable of. As he considered her motive, he wondered whether Lynne was trying to get rid of their parents in order to get access to their money. Russell and Marie were by no means wealthy, but they did own their share of the farm and had a modest nest egg which Lynne and John were set to inherit. John didn't realise it at the time, but Lynne did want her inheritance early, and she had been working on accessing it for many years already. What John didn't know was that years before his mother Marie met Russell, she had been set to inherit a large family farm. At some point, she accepted an offer to be bought out of her share, and she set the money aside as a nest egg for her future. Somehow, Lynne had found out about the money. For years, she had been calling her mum in private and asking for money for some crisis or another that she needed saving from. At times, she would claim to have cancer and need treatment. At others, she would say she was pregnant but couldn't afford to keep the baby unless she got a cash injection. Marie always obliged her daughter. John only found this out years down the track. In his own words, quote, "Mum and Dad loved Lynne. I think it's probably harder when you adopt a child because you have to prove you love that child, you know? You feel you have to make it work. You can't fail. They tried and tried and tried. They always tried to steer her back. She would always say what they wanted to hear. Then she'd go straight out and do the opposite. Every time. She was given so many chances. People will never know how many chances that woman was given. I saw my role in life, once I grew up, to be a shield and to protect my parents from her as much as I could. If I found information that affected us as a family or them as parents, then I had to intervene." Lynne was smart enough to know exactly how to guilt her parents into giving her what she wanted. At some point in the early 2000s, she used the internet to connect with her birth family. Whenever it looked like Marie or Russell were going to deny her, she would break their hearts by telling them she wished she had been raised by her real mum and dad. This nearly always resulted in them giving in to her demands. In 2006, Lynne returned to New Zealand permanently, under the guise of caring for Marie, who was dying of cancer. It was only after her death that John found out the extent of his sister's financial demands, when he discovered that Marie's $40,000 nest egg was completely gone, and all of it had been given to his sister. After Marie's death, Lynne moved to Tauranga and began living with her new partner, Graham Martin. He was a father of two and owned a house in Welcome Bay. Once again, little is known about her movements in the coming years, right up until the night of her father's death in January 2013. By then, Russell was 88 years old. Despite his age and deteriorating health, he was determined to live as independently as he could in his own home. This required a steady flow of carers and a lot of support from his son. John lived less than 10 minutes' drive from the farmhouse. Every night he would serve his father a meal, give him his medications, and help him get into bed safely. Then he would lock up and head home for the night. On the 24th of January 2013, John followed the same routine. As he handed Russell his nightly sleeping pill, his father told him that Lynne had called earlier in the day. There was nothing pleasant about the 22-minute call. Russell shared that Lynne had demanded that Russell pay her out her share of his estate. When he refused, she demanded that he give her his boat. In her opinion, he couldn't use it due to his declining health, and she deserved it for all the help she had given him and Marie over the years. When Russell again said no to her demands, she told him she was coming over the next day to pick it up, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. Less than 6 hours after John tucked his dad into bed, he received a phone call of his own, but this time it was the police. They had been called to reports of a fire at Russell's farmhouse. John raced to the scene to find a wreck of embers and ash in the place where his childhood home had once stood. Despite the best efforts of fire crews, the blaze was unable to be extinguished before it destroyed the house and everything in it, including Russell. Even as waves of shock washed over John, he knew exactly who was responsible: his own sister, Lynne. Tina Smallman was the on-call detective assigned to the fire investigation that night. As she stood next to John at the scene, he told her about the phone call Russell had with Lynne the previous morning. John told the detective he was sure that the fire was intentional, and his sister had killed Russell to get her hands on his money. He confirmed that she was set to inherit at least $150,000 from the estate, and she needed it more than ever as she had recently been declared bankrupt. It's easy to look back and say this case should have been pretty straightforward from then, but it wasn't, and it would take 10 years and thousands of hours of police work for John to taste the justice he desired. Once the flames and embers were extinguished, only rubble remained of the house which had stood for 100 years. Fire investigators arrived on the scene to identify the cause of the fire and determine whether it was accidental or intentional. While they got to work, Tina organised for an officer to visit Lynne's home in person to deliver the news of her father's death. At 5:20 a.m, a police officer knocked on the door of Lynne and Graham's home in Tauranga. He answered the door and told them that Lynne wasn't at home because she had spent the night in Auckland. When the officer left, he called Lynne to tell her that the police had been over and she needed to contact them urgently. Later that morning, Lynne placed a call to the Tauranga police station and left her details for them to return her call. At around 10:30 a.m, Lynne and Graham showed up at the Tauranga police station, and they were notified officially about the fire and Russell's death. They were also informed that John suspected she was involved. However, Lynne told the officers that she was nowhere near the farm on the night of the fire. She had spent the night in Auckland with a friend and had only just returned that morning. Back at the scene, the fire investigators had narrowed down the origin of the fire. Damage to the roofing iron above the kitchen area was more significant than other areas of the house. That indicated the fire had burned the longest in that location. However, the examiners were unable to pinpoint the exact cause of the fire because no ignition point or accelerant was identified. The fire had burned so intensely that any helpful evidence had been incinerated. For these reasons, they were unable to determine whether the fire was started accidentally or deliberately. Ultimately, it was ruled as unexplained. The lack of proof of arson was the first of many roadblocks faced by investigators in this case. Even though John was sure his sister had used the fire as a cover for Russell's murder, there was no clear evidence that it was intentionally lit, which meant the police were limited in what they could investigate. Despite the challenges the case presented, Detective Tina Smallman sensed something was off about the whole thing. She promised John she would get to the bottom of whatever had happened, no matter how long it took. Neither of them ever considered exactly how long that promise would take to fulfill. 2 weeks after Russell's death, investigators got their first solid lead. Lynne's phone records contradicted her version of events. Between 8:56 and 10:47 p.m, Lynne's phone made several phone calls which were transmitted via cell phone towers, located right next to Russell's home. They indicated that her phone was no more than 10 kilometres or 6 miles away from the cell tower for at least those 2 hours. When Lynne was confronted with the phone evidence, she refused to budge from her original statement. She was unable to explain why her phone had pinged off the tower near the farmhouse, except to say, quote, "I wasn't there, I don't know." Officers also spoke to Lynne's boss, Rachel Ralston, at the employment relations firm where she worked once a week. They discovered that on the day of the fire, Lynne left work early after complaining that she felt sick. On the drive home, CCTV cameras captured her stopping at a liquor store to buy a bottle of scrumpy, which is a form of apple cider. At 2:20 p.m, she called her husband Graham to say she wasn't going to be home that night. She told him she was going to visit a friend in Auckland and to spend the evening at the Sky City Casino. After hanging up on that call, she sent a text message to her boss. It reads, "Do me a big favour. If anyone contacts you, tell them I have been with you all night. I'll explain later." But instead of Lynne heading in the direction of New Zealand's biggest city, she drove towards Opotiki, right next to where Russell lived. The fire was reported to emergency services at around 1:30 a.m. on the 25th of January. Later that day, Lynne turned up for work looking dishevelled and nervous. Rachel asked what was going on, and Lynne said she was worried because she had lied to Graham about where she was the night before. She used that as the explanation for why she had texted Rachel and asked her to give her an alibi for the night. Lynne confessed that instead of going to Auckland, she had driven to Ohope and slept in her car. Later that morning, a detective returned Lynne's phone call. Rachel overheard the conversation, and Lynne saying that Russell had cut her out of his will. This is despite her being in possession of a letter where Russell had described his love-at-first-sight moment when he adopted Lynne. In that same letter, Russell told Lynne she would still get $150,000 from his estate despite her terrible behaviour over the years. When Lynne was confronted with a second round of evidence, including the CCTV footage which proved she hadn't gone to Auckland, she admitted she had lied to her partner about her movements that night, but she continued to deny she was anywhere near her father's house. A few months after Russell's death, the police asked the public for information on a blue Nissan March hatchback, registration GAU 331. The vehicle had been sighted travelling between Tauranga and Gisborne on the evening before the fire. At the time, it was being driven by a middle-aged Caucasian woman. What the police didn't mention was that they already knew who the registered owner and driver of the vehicle was. What they really wanted was reliable eyewitness accounts, which put Lynne Martin at the scene. Sadly, their request for information didn't net any solid sightings. The fire had destroyed any potential evidence of Lynne being inside the house on the night of the fire, and the CCTV footage showed she wasn't where she said she was, but that wasn't enough to prove she had started a fire, especially because the investigators hadn't even determined it was intentionally lit. Without any concrete evidence, the investigation slowed and then stalled completely. 1 year passed, then 2, 3, and 4. John was losing hope that the case would ever be solved. In the meantime, Russell's estate was distributed and Lynne was paid the $150,000 she had been promised. But even that wasn't enough, and she contested the will and demanded a bigger share. In the end, John was forced to take out a mortgage to buy his sister out of the farm and pay a further $100,000 she had been awarded by the court. In 2015, Lynne married Graham, and the couple set up a steam cleaning business. In 2016, they were praised by local police for offering free graffiti removal services to businesses in the town of Matamata, which is famous for Hobbiton. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Imagine believing your sister stole from your parents and murdered your father, and then you have to pay them out of your own pocket to settle an inheritance. While John struggled to come to terms with his sister's actions and his father's senseless death, Detective Tina Smallman had not forgotten her promise. There was no new evidence to hand, and she felt the best option was to try an altogether more unusual approach to put this case to bed. She knew the only way to find out what really happened that night was for the killer to confess. But she knew that dealing with someone as cold-hearted as Lynne, the kind of woman who was prepared to burn her own father to death, meant conventional methods wouldn't suffice. The best way to get incriminating information from Lynne was directly, but instead of trying to extract it during an interrogation, the detective employed the services of an undercover officer. The officer went by the cover name of Millie Tate. She first met Graham and Lynne when she stayed on their property, which they rented out to tourists travelling in campervans around New Zealand. Millie struck up a friendship with Lynne, and over the next 18 months she came to stay with the couple several times. At each visit she would provide a little bit more of her backstory, which went something like this. Millie had spent the last 5 years in Australia, but she came back to New Zealand after her partner started blackmailing her. This was after she was essayed by a man at a party. Millie had got away from the man and left, but then she saw him walking down the street. She used her car to run him over, which caused serious injuries, but she didn't stop to check on him. When she got home, she wrote about exactly what had happened in her personal diary and hid it in her bedroom. But then the Australian police began looking into the hit and run. When they came knocking, the relationship with her partner broke down. He found her diary and was attempting to blackmail her into signing over her half of their house. Lynne's advice to Millie: torch the house and destroy the evidence. Quote, torch the house, there's nothing left of the house, there's insurance for you, the diary's gone, and he is safe out of the house. Torch it. Arson is the easiest thing in the world and very hard to prove. She went on to tell Millie that the best way to start a non-suspicious fire was to put a pot of fat on the stove, turn up the heat, and eventually it would explode into flame. She warned Millie not to use an accelerant. Quote, you've got to keep right away from that because you will get caught and it will be seen as arson. Lynne had more tips for Millie. Don't take your mobile phone, rent a vehicle under a fake name, get a friend to create a false alibi, and don't leave any fingerprints or DNA. She also advised Millie to cover any evidence of someone else being in the house and to hang around the scene to make sure it went up in flames completely. Millie and Lynne even went so far as to do a test run. They boiled a pot of lard on a camping stove and watched as it burst into flames, just like Lynne had anticipated. After this conversation was recorded, fire investigators took a closer look at the evidence collected from Russell's farmhouse. They consulted a fire expert who concluded that the fire could very well have been started by a pot of oil on the stove. The experts conducted experiments of their own and found that a block of lard in a pot at full heat would take just 14 minutes to burst into flame. The damage caused to the stove in that experiment was nearly identical to the damage found on the appliance from Russell's own kitchen. With that discovery, the fire was officially determined to be arson, which made Russell's death murder. Soon after this reclassification, investigators secured a court order to bug Lynne and Graham's home. Now you might be thinking, what could they hope to overhear more than 7 years after the crime? Well, the detectives had one more ace up their sleeves. They reached out to New Zealand's own cold case TV show and asked them to feature the story of Russell Martin's death. The investigators now knew that the case was a murder, but the TV show agreed to cover it as undetermined. When the story went to air on the 3rd of November 2020, investigators banked on the fact that Lynne wouldn't be able to resist watching the story of her own crime. And they were right. She took it a step further by offering a running commentary throughout the 1-hour program. When the phone call between Lynne and Russell was mentioned, she stated, quote, there was nothing, there was no malice in it, no nothing, he was in good spirits. Except when her husband asked if she had a go at her father that day, she replied, oh, I was always having a go at but I can't say that. The show also interviewed detectives involved in the investigation. They spoke heavily about a person of interest in the fire, but that the person had refused to answer their questions. The reason for featuring the story was that they hoped someone would have additional information, and that with the passage of years they would feel comfortable coming forward. In the hours after the show aired, Lynne continued to discuss the case with her husband. She was recorded saying, "They can put me down there, but it doesn't prove I went to Whatatutu. It doesn't prove I set the house on fire." At the same time the show was airing, the police offered a reward of up to $100,000 for information about Russell's death.
Today, police are announcing a reward for information about the death of 88-year-old Gisborne man Ronald Russell Ellison in 2013. Russell, as he was known to his family and friends, died in a suspicious fire at his home at 290 Whatatutu Road, Te Karaka, near Gisborne, in the early hours of Friday the 25th of January 2013. His death had been the subject of an open investigation for nearly 8 years, and police are confident the fire was started intentionally to cause Russell harm. We know there are people out there with information that will help us finally solve this case, and we are urging them to come forward. The reward will be paid for relevant information or evidence, which will lead the investigation team to both the identity and conviction of the person or people responsible for his death. Immunity against prosecution will be considered for any accomplice who provides information or evidence to police and who is not the main offender.
Lynne already knew about the phone tower data, but she was confident the coverage of the case on TV and the offer of a reward wouldn't lead to anything. In her mind, it had been 7 years since the fire, and they hadn't arrested her, so she was off the hook. And maybe she would have been, if she'd just kept her mouth shut. During another conversation with Graham, Lynne confessed she wished it was her brother who had died. Quote, "I'd kill my brother if I had the chance, I really would." And then later, quote, "The wrong cunt died. It should have been my brother. I'd love to see him be a crispy critter." Phone and home surveillance recorded more than 22,000 conversations during the course of the investigation, which was codenamed Operation Puha. This was on top of the recordings made by Millie during 157 days undercover, having interactions with Lynne and Graham. Using those recordings and piecing together what evidence they did have, investigators believe what actually happened on the day of the fire looks more like this. Lynne made the phone call to her father to demand money from him. He denied her, and she flew into a fit of rage. She had no money and was desperate to get her hands on Russell's cash. So she told her boss she felt sick and drove 240 kilometres or 149 miles to her childhood home, stopping on the way to pick up some liquid courage in the form of scrumpy. On the drive, she called her husband to say she wouldn't be home for the night and texted her boss to secure an alibi. Then she waited for John to finish putting Russell to bed and entered the house using a spare key Russell always kept on a hook attached to the water tank outside. John had returned the key when he left on the night of the fire, and the fire didn't touch the tank, but that key has never been recovered. Lynne then put a pot of lard on the stove, turned it up to full heat, and exited through the back door, which was found unlocked. She drove her car a short distance away and watched as the home and her father went up in flames. When she was sure Russell hadn't survived, she drove off into the night, just as fire engines were called to the scene. The next morning, she drove home to make it look like she had just returned from Auckland. She took a shower, got dressed, and went to work like usual. Now that there was a clearer picture of what had actually happened to Russell Ellison, the investigation progressed at speed. In November 2022, John received a call 10 years in the making. Tina Smallman notified him that Lynne was about to be arrested and charged with Russell's murder. At the time, John was in hospital and undergoing treatment for throat cancer. Quote, "She told me, 'Remember a long time ago I said I would call you if we ever made an arrest. I said yes, and she said, well, this is that call.' Tears just streamed down my face." A year later, the trial finally got underway. Up until that point, Lynne had been granted name suppression, but in the lead up to the proceedings, prosecution lawyers had argued for the name suppression to be lifted. New Zealanders who had been following the case from the beginning were at last able to see the face and hear the identity of a woman who was accused of murdering her own father, all for money. The prosecution were the first to put forward their opening statements. From their perspective, the case was fairly straightforward. Lynne was bankrupt, which made her desperate to get her hands on her share of Russell's estate. When he refused to pay her out before he died, she accelerated the timeline and burnt his house down with him asleep inside. More than 50 witnesses were called on behalf of the Crown. They included the fire officer who was called in to establish the cause of the fire. He told the jury that he found Russell's remains on his bed, right next to the charred remains of his walker. The position of Russell's body indicated that he had attempted to stand up and escape the fire. However, he would have been overcome by the smoke and heat before he had a chance to leave his bed. Russell's body was severely burned, and some parts had been reduced to fragments of bone. Glass from his bedroom window had exploded due to the heat, and shards were found melted onto Russell's bones. The officer who notified Lynne about her father's death was also called to provide testimony. He described how Lynne and her husband Graham had turned up at the Tauranga police station at around 10:30 a.m. on the 25th of January. This was more than 5 hours after an officer knocked on their front door with the intent of notifying her about Russell's death. When the officer told Lynne what had happened and that her father was deceased, her response was completely unemotional. She said she had heard about a fire on the radio and had put two and two together. The officer was surprised by how disinterested Lynne was at the news of her father's horrific death, and the only question she asked was whether there was anything left of the house. The jury also heard from a master locksmith who had examined what remained of the lock from the back door of the farmhouse. He testified that the back door had been unlocked at the time of the fire, even though John had double-checked it was locked when he left. The door could only have been unlocked from the inside. Then it was time to hear from the person who knew Lynne the most, her brother John. John described his relationship with Russell as extremely close. Quote, "We were the best of buddies. He was at the stage of life of getting older, friends were getting fewer. We were best friends, workmates, confidants, just family." John was able to provide a unique insight into Lynne's behaviour right from the time she was a young child. He shared how in recent years, precious family heirlooms would systematically disappear from Russell's house after Lynne had visited. Russell and Marie had 2 wooden display cabinets which stored his mother's most prized possessions, many of which had been wedding gifts. These included dinner sets, silver cutlery and utensils, cup and saucer sets, brass and crystal glasses. Marie also had a collection of jewellery, including a large emerald brooch, several strings of pearls, a cameo necklace, and cameo brooches. When John first noticed a few of the items had gone, he didn't pay it much thought. But as the cabinets became noticeably emptier, he realised what was going on. His sister was stealing from her parents. He found out later she had been selling the items on TradeMe, which is similar to eBay. The most devastating item to disappear in this way was a genuine samurai sword that Ronald had obtained while stationed in Japan after serving in the army during World War II. Quote, "It was a recognised piece of family history. Dad didn't speak much about the war, but if you spoke to him about the sword, he spoke to you about Japan." When John confronted Lynne about the sword, she said a friend had taken it back to Australia. John later found out she had actually sold it on TradeMe for $1,000. When it came time to discuss what the 10 years since his dad's death had been like, John said, "I've had the burden of knowing I was my father's keeper and I've failed. I knew there was a threat, but I honestly believed I'd have more time. I said to him, 'Okay, Dad, we'll have to tighten things up around here so stuff doesn't go missing.' I went home that night thinking I'd tell the local cop the next day about the call and we'd do something about security. I didn't know Lynne was just down the road from the house at the time." A marine store owner backed up John's story about Lynne stealing from Russell. He testified about purchasing a boat he believed belonged to her, when it was in fact owned by Russell. John noticed the boat was missing from the farmhouse one day, and he later saw it parked on the lot of a local boat seller. The owner of the store told John he had agreed to pay Lynne $4,000 for the boat. John told him what was going on, and the transaction was cancelled. When Lynne found out what John had done, She rang the boat seller 5 times in 1 hour and hurled abuse at him, telling him that his business was finished. All of these witness accounts painted a picture of an emotionally manipulative person, but while the jury were given some evidence of Lynne's troubling history, they weren't given all of it. For example, they were told about her 1999 arson conviction in Australia, and they were told that in 2010 she was ordered by a court to repay someone $11,000. What they weren't told is that the repayment order was because Lynne had systematically robbed an 82-year-old at a rest home where she worked as a carer. The woman was in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's when Lynne stole her bank card and withdrew more than $12,000. She also attempted to alter the address on her victims' bank accounts so that she could have total control over her money. Lynne later admitted to 22 charges of theft and fraud and was sentenced to 300 hours of community work and to repay every dollar she had stolen. During that case, Lynne stated that she had stolen the money to fund a gambling addiction. Soon after that conviction, she texted Russell and demanded $150,000 as her share of his estate. She threatened that if he denied her, she would go to the police and tell them he had essayed her as a child. Russell refused to pay, and when John saw some of the text messages, he filed a police report saying that Lynne was blackmailing Russell. Later that year, Lynne filed for bankruptcy. In 2011, she followed through on her threat and reported that both Russell and John had essayed her while she was a child. Both men denied the allegations, and a subsequent investigation found no evidence that Lynne's claims were truthful. No charges were ever filed. In court, during her murder trial, Lynne doubled down on these claims, but added that not only had Russell essayed her, he was also the father of the child she had aborted when she was 16. In 2009, the year prior to the theft charges, Lynne was in court for her third drink driving conviction. When she was pulled over, she had told the officer she had terminal cancer and wanted to go out with a big bang. She was found to be more than twice the legal limit. In that case, she was sentenced to 9 months of supervision and lost her license for 15 months. At the time of Russell's murder, Lynne had just $119.99 in her bank account. She received an unemployment benefit and earned $60 to $80 a week for part-time work she did with Rachel. She also had debts to several finance companies totaling $10,000 and the earlier court order to repay the $11,000 she had stolen from the rest home resident back in 2010. All of the evidence the prosecution was allowed to present contributed to the perspective that Lynne had been trying to access her inheritance for many years. Taking her parents' money under false pretenses, stealing their possessions, and falsely accusing John and her father of abuse were just some of the ploys she used to get her hands on the cash. When they didn't work, she turned to murder. And it worked. Lynne inherited more than $225,000 in the wake of Russell's death. Lynne's defense was pretty simple. According to her lawyer, there was no proof she had gone to her father's house, and there was no proof that the fire was even suspicious. During opening statements, her lawyer said, quote, "There is no smoking gun, no confessions, no admission." She pointed to the fact that there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no confession, and no eyewitnesses who could put Lynne at the house that night. The entire defense was built on rewriting the narrative of Lynne's upbringing and her relationship with her father. They didn't present a single piece of evidence. Instead, they called on witnesses to testify to an alternate version of who Lynne was. The argument was that the police had tunnel vision when it came to Lynne, and they were twisting the investigation to lay the blame on her. The lawyer stated that the police had decided on the night of the fire that she was to blame, and they pursued her relentlessly. They explained away her telling the undercover officer how to start a fire as simply being because Lynne had done a lot of research since Russell's death, and she wasn't broke because Graham would give her money whenever she needed it. They went on to say that John and Lynne both hated their father equally, especially since Lynne had been essayed by him. They also complained that the listening devices were deeply intrusive and didn't really prove anything. There was no smoking gun confession, and despite more than 22,000 conversations being recorded, only 5 were played to the court, which proved Lynne really wasn't guilty at all. Quote, "Police must have been highly disappointed with the minimum yield from this operation. Only scraps the Crown is trying to spin or interpret to infer something." Lynne's husband Graham testified in her defence and said he had, quote, "no reason not to believe her when she said she didn't hurt her father." A few days after the fire, he found out that Lynne had lied about her movements that night, which upset him, but he had forgiven her for her mistake, and he believed every word she said. He also claimed it wasn't unusual for her to stay away overnight at short notice to go drinking and fishing. Graham also offered an alternate suspect to murder. He testified that Lynne believed her son had committed arson, and she was prepared to accept the conviction in order to protect him. He told the court that during the investigation, he was made to feel like he shouldn't trust Lynne and he should separate from her. Quote, "They were trying to turn me against my wife. I told them it was bullshit and I didn't believe them." Lynne's lawyer pointed the finger at John as the murderer, if the fire was even suspicious at all. They painted him as the son who was set to inherit the farm, but only when his dad died. She went on to suggest that a man who lived in a house bus on the farm or a local gang member might be to blame. And finally, she laid the blame at the feet of the victim himself. She offered the idea that Russell might have got up in the night to go to the toilet, put a pot on the stove, and gone back to bed absent-mindedly. Quote, "Can you be sure it was not a terrible, tragic accident? There are too many doubts here. You cannot be sure to the high standard necessary. The only just verdict is not proven beyond reasonable doubt." Lynne's murder trial had been estimated to take 5 weeks to complete, but in the end just 12 days were needed. Jury deliberations were equally as short. After 2.5 hours, they reached their verdict. Lynne Mares Martin was guilty of murdering her own father. At the reading of the verdict, Lynne immediately burst into tears and loud sobs. In response, John stated, quote, "I felt happy that it was the right decision. I felt vindicated that all my accusations, including what I told police on the night, that I knew who did this. It was my bloody sister. I told them that night. There's been persecution from the defence, claiming it's only John Allison's word that headed the investigation in this direction. So I feel vindicated that what I initiated has been proven the truth." Russell's death had been avenged after 10 long years, but the sense of justice was short-lived, like less than 24 hours short-lived.
A woman who was yesterday found guilty of murdering her elderly father was this morning found dead in a Gisborne police station cell.
Gisborne Police Station. This is where convicted killer Lynne Martin was discovered dead in a cell this morning. Just yesterday, she was convicted of murdering her father, 88-year-old Ronald Russell Ellison, by setting his house alight in 2013. During a phone call with News Hub last November, she maintained her innocence.
I didn't do it. It's as simple as that. I'm not going to jail for something I haven't done. I'll tell you that now. And I've been telling everyone that. There is no way I'm going to jail for something I haven't done.
Claiming she was the victim of police harassment.
They came at me right from the start saying, "We know you've done it." And I went, "Whoa, okay, really? You can say that?" They've treated me like right from the beginning.
Going on to suggest the fire was an accident.
It was a 100-year-old house, for God's sake. Don't judge me until you've heard the whole story, because there's always two sides to a story.
Lynne's cause of death has not been disclosed and a coroner's inquiry is currently underway. John's response was, quote, "I can't feel sorry for someone who killed my father. There is no emotion just right at this moment. She has been convicted of killing my father. There is no sorrow." Not long after Lynne was found dead, the police announced they were attempting to recoup the $225,000 inheritance she was awarded from Russell's estate. In New Zealand, it is illegal for criminals to benefit financially from their crimes, and officials believe the money rightfully belongs to John. Lynne used the cash to buy a share in the property she owned with Graham in Matamata. A restraining order was placed on the property to stop him being able to sell or withdraw Lynne's share. That court order remains in place. The final words of this story belong to John. Quote, Lynne was like a runaway truck in the middle of a country road full of sheep. She has barreled through her life, smacking into people. Some ended up maimed, some ended up deeply bruised, and some walked away. But she just carried on.